Hi, I'm Doug Draper with Acme Distribution in the Denver Transportation Club, and I'm pleased to present our 10-part series, Supply Chain and Logistics, the Storytellers. The series is brought to you by Cap Logistics, and Cap Logistics are experts to offer you customized transportation solutions for every need, so I encourage you to visit caplogistics.com today. All right, so today's topic could be simply called the Big Chill. So we're going to talk about the cold chain and the temperature-controlled supply chain, and our expert today is Jakob Sadd. Jakob, welcome.
Thank you.
He's with JBS USA up in Greeley, Colorado. So we're really excited to have you here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, excited to be here.
I know it's a little bit of a road trip coming down from Fort Collins, so thanks for that. So before we jump into the topic today, why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself, kind of how you got in the industry, and a little bit about what you do on a daily basis now.
Sure. It was really just kind of luck, honestly. I was graduating college about 10 years ago and kind of, on the job hunt and applied at JBS USA. Had no clue what it was, which is a little funny.
Sounds familiar to all of us, right?
Yep. And, just kind of fell in love with international logistics mostly, and that's kind of where I started, was in that department, shipping beef and pork and poultry to Asia mostly, and then I kind of worked my way up the chain there and got into freezer management and cold storage management for them for a couple of years, and
right.
I guess that's what makes me the expert.
Yeah, of course. That's what we try to bring it in. So, all right. Well, we like to keep things pretty simple and then go into more details through our discussion here today. So on a 10,000-foot view, when people say cold chain or temperature-controlled logistics, kind of talk a little bit about what that means and maybe how it differs a little bit from the traditional supply chain that people talk about.
Sure. Cold chain being, keeping your products at a controlled temperature. That can range from freezing, -10, or even for ice cream below that, all the way up to fresh, in the 40s.
Okay.
So it's really just keeping that product in your specified temp range, the entire process all the way through to your customer. I would say that differs from, kind of traditional dry storage in the fact that you don't have to worry about, on dry, you don't have to worry about temperature fluctuations, but there's a lot of, on the cold chain side, there's a lot of even little nuances that if it fluctuates by a couple degrees, your product could be spoiled or bad or discounted in some sort of way.
Interesting. So you talked about frozen, and then you said -10. So from the layman's perspective, including me, I'm like, all right, frozen is anything below 32 degrees.
Right.
But obviously what you said, -14 is substantially lower than -32. So why that designation, and why so much colder than what the average person would think frozen would be?
So for when you freeze product, if you just freeze it to 32, or at least in our business for protein, it doesn't get completely frozen. You can still kind of put a little pressure on the meat and it'll squeeze. Mm-hmm. If you get it down to 0 or -10, it'll be what we call hard frozen. There's no really water left in the product at all. It doesn't squish, or it'll just be hard frozen, honestly. And that's kind of where we look at it as being frozen for us, is when it's completely hard frozen.
Gotcha. So it's the squish factor that you have to take into consideration.
Yeah, and I'm no expert. I'm not in QA, but that's kind of how I understand it.
Gotcha. Good deal. So one thing we always think about with the cold chain is food, things of that nature. But I know that the cold chain can apply to a lot of other industries out there. Mm-hmm. So talk a little bit about other things that we may think about in the cold chain, and so just kind of elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, so one of the kind of new and upcoming trends in the cold chain is pharmaceuticals.
Okay.
A lot of companies are finding that if they ship their medicines at a more controlled temperature, they get better quality and it lasts longer. So that's another. And then floral, so flowers from South America, a lot of stuff that you see coming up, that's more temperature controlled now than it used to be as well, because again, they find that if they keep them at a more controlled temperature, they either stop the flower from actually blooming until it gets to their desired location, or they slow down that process.
Interesting. What's the temperature range on a flower that would come up? Obviously, it's not -14.
No. I think it's probably around in the 40 to 45 area. So not frozen, but not, too hot either.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So one thing I forgot to ask you whenever we started is kind of the different levels of temperature controlled. In my limited experience, I know that there's temperature controlled, there's refrigerated, and then there's different letters. So talk about the different, I don't know, 3 or 4 different types of temperature zones, if you will.
Sure, I would say, like you were saying, temperature controlled, that'd be above, the freezing mark, 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Anything above that is going to be what they call temperature controlled. I would say between like 32 and 25 is called fresh. So it's not frozen, like I said. It's not hard frozen. It just keeps the product at a consistent temperature so that it doesn't freeze unless it's, at that temperature for a very long time. And then anything below really 10 degrees Fahrenheit is frozen. And then ice cream is a whole nother ballgame that's way below freezing, or way below zero even. I think they freeze it at -20. So,
wow, that's you never would have thought. Like I said, it's 31 degrees, it's ice cream, so we're good to go.
Yeah.
So, obviously, we talked about the slight fluctuations in temperature, whether that's 29 or 31 degrees to 33. Tell us about the regulations, and I guess tell us a little bit about government regulations and then maybe industry regulations and what those entail, and then maybe we'll talk a little bit about fines and penalties and how those things are audited. So let's talk about with government regulations, what are out there that would cover all different groups?
There are some government regulations. They're not really defined on the temperature itself. It's more the type of product that you have. So if you want a fresh product, it needs to stay in that sort of not frozen range. And if you want a frozen product, it obviously needs to be hard frozen. And they audit your standard operating procedures and what you have in place to make sure that they're consistent with product quality. But it's not. There's not really your frozen product must be at this temperature. It's kind of up to the producer. Got it.
And then is there any state or industry type of regulations that are different, or another layer on top of that?
There's some industry regulations. There's a cold chain alliance, and there's a few other alliances within warehousing that they have standard guidelines on what is frozen, what's considered fresh, the temperature, the time that it needs to be at that temperature, those sort of things. They're more industry standards as opposed to really regulations. And if you get into international regulations, those are totally different than just kind of local, state, and
right. So speaking of international regulations, so here in the U.S., I'm assuming that the regulatory body is the USDA, or is that the primary? In
my realm of the world, it's the USDA. There's also AMS, which is a third-party auditing system that the USDA uses to audit your just procedures, and they set the guidelines for each country. The USDA works with each different country's governing bodies for food and health, and then they kind of set those guidelines together. And then when you're exporting, if you're going or importing, you have to, fall into those guidelines.
Gotcha. So on the international front, it's the U.S. works with, and I guess back up, I didn't quite follow you. So is there an international body, kind of like the UN is on international standards? Because I'm sure going into South Africa may be slightly different than Australia, which could be different than Canada.
Sure. Each country has their own type of food and drug administration, and they each set their own guidelines. Now there's industry standards that each of them will comply with. That's set forth by like USAPEC, which is the poultry's kind of industry-wide standard across the whole globe.
Right.
And there's the Meat Export Federation, that's for red meat, and they also set standards for across the globe. But each country can make their own rules that don't have to comply with those bodies of governing.
Right. So if a country, let's say you're shipping from the U.S. to South Africa, right? South Africa. So if the South African regulations are not as strict as the U.S., I would assume you have to maintain to U.S. standards and vice versa, if for
Correct.
some reason South Africa was more aggressive?
Yeah, well, since it's being produced from my point of view in the U.S., you have to comply with the U.S. standards first.
Okay.
And then after you've complied with those, if there's any additional standards in sort of like for testing or proving that you've kept product at a certain temperature for a certain amount of time above and beyond what the U.S.
Yep.
regulates, then you have to comply with the country standards. And same with importing into the U.S., you have to comply with the country that you've produced it at first, and then the U.S. standards additionally.
Huh.
So like a lot of the South American countries, they require additional testing and certification called trike testing. And basically what the USC has to do is cage it off in a certain area of a freezer that's completely separated from all their product for, depending on what temperature the freezer is operating at, dictates how much time it has to be separated from that product.
Right. Yeah.
So,
Regulation. So
yeah.
maybe that dives or dovetails well into my next comment, which is related to technologies and resources that you have to comply with the regulations. So let me ask that question a little bit differently: is what cool technologies are out there that help you maintain control and visibility of the temperature of the items moving the supply chain that you would be able to provide to a regulatory agency whenever you are audited? So what's some cool stuff out there, if you will, that's emerging that helps you with those?
I think that's kind of where the industry is maybe lagging behind. We're not too advanced on the technology front. I mean, we have ways that you can monitor the temperature within a freezer remotely, or even a container now. It's starting to come on board where you can monitor that temperature within a container all the time. It used to be as soon as it lost, kind of cell phone coverage,
Right.
you lost all visibility.
Right.
And now they're starting to come out with satellite tracking and that sort of thing. But that's really, I think, the next big step in the industry is getting more visibility all the time.
Right.
To obviously domestically, you can monitor a truck remotely without any problems. GPS, they have temperature monitors on them all the time. I mean, you get alerts, like with the rail lines. You get an alert if a boxcar goes out of temp for any amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some things domestically that we have, but really the next big step is kind of the full visibility all the way throughout, production to getting it to the end customer.
Right. Interesting. So let's use the rail as an example, right? So you're domestically shipping something from one side of the country to the other. It's on the rail, and you have the temperature sensors, and all of a sudden something goes odd. There's a red. It's 3 o'clock in the morning, and you get a note that says, "Hey, this is out of temperature range." Like, what do you do? What options do you have in the cold chain to react?
Normally, you would just contact the rail company initially and just see what the problem is. It could just be ran out of fuel or something, a small part broke, and they can get it fixed right away. So if they come back and say, it's a major malfunction, the next step would be just offloading it into another rail car that is operating correctly. And in that case, normally they hire the labor to do it, and you just have, kind of a surveyor watching it to make sure your product is still acceptable. If it's not, then there's, obviously some sort of claim involved. But if it is, then it just keeps moving, and there's no real delay besides that, that offloading and reloading. But for the most part, you hear, a malfunction and everybody kind of freaks out a little bit.
Right. Yeah.
But they're usually not as severe as kind of where your mind goes. It's usually just like it ran out of fuel, we had to refuel it, or a small part broke and it got fixed. And a lot of the ways you're shipping, frozen or fresh product,
Right.
they're made to withstand temperature, variations pretty well. So it could be 100 degrees outside, and even if that rail car isn't working, it'll still hold temp for 5 or 6 hours without fluctuating,
Right.
without any sort of cooling going on. So.
Yeah. So when your freezer blows out in your house, just keep it closed for a while
Exactly.
you have some time to address it. So let's talk or contrast and compare, if you will, a cold chain versus a standard ambient type of temperature. So walk us through kind of, let's use the example here domestically on the rail car. So talk about shipping some frozen meat, the proteins that you're familiar with, from one part of the country to the other. So let's say East Coast to West Coast. On an ambient environment, maybe walk through a little bit with the originating warehouse, the transportation, the destination warehouse. How is that different in the cold chain versus the ambient warehouse? And then secondly, maybe each step, what's the cost differences? And so maybe we'll take each step and say, all right, what does a warehouse look like at origin compared to an ambient?
Sure. So the first step for us is always we have guidelines to get that product into the cold storage within X amount of hours. And it's all deemed by our QA. So it has to, from production, it has to get into the either the freezer or refrigerated area within a certain amount of hours, and then it needs to also be frozen within a certain amount of hours. And if it's not, then it gets rejected and we have to get QA involved. But if it is, then we have a truck come pick it up. It's all the freezer, even when it's loading it, the dock is at 32 degrees, so it's always controlled temperature. You're never going to get a loading dock of 70 degrees where your product can start to thaw if it sits out for a while. It'll get loaded on a truck that's set at the right temperature, and then it goes cross country or in a rail car, and then it'll deliver to another location that is also temperature controlled at the same 32 degrees. Or if your customer wants it at a distribution center that may be a little colder, you deliver it to wherever they're specifying, and it's always kept at a minimum temperature requirement. I would say an ambient, obviously the temperature doesn't matter. It's probably not as time sensitive in terms of getting it to that from production to that storage location as maybe refrigerated or frozen is. And again, it's and you can put it in a truck that the trailer can get up to 80 degrees or hotter, and it's not going to affect the product, as opposed to on a frozen or fresh good. If it gets that hot, it's going to spoil.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Do you have any idea of the cost implications? So if you're paying X dollars for warehouse or transportation, is it a percentage greater on average? Or talk about the cost implications with a cold chain and a regular.
Sure. So in a cold chain, you're obviously paying additional costs to pay for the utilities involved in operating that, at a colder temperature. And, I don't know the exact cost difference, but I would say at least 50 to 75% more than an ambient.
Wow, I didn't realize it'd be that high.
Yeah.
That's pretty crazy. That's crazy. So talk about the international. That's your forte. So you just described a domestic move from East Coast to West Coast. How are those parts different or the same? Let's say you're sending something from here, and we'll just continue to use South Africa as our example. So what are the steps involved to get it to from the U.S. there? Sure.
So it's going to be obviously production, and then South Africa, you're probably going to have it frozen. So it'll have to go to a cold storage that'll freeze the product, or if you have one internally, have to get it frozen. Then you'll deliver it. If it's from kind of the Midwest area, you'll have to deliver it to a coastal region that can transload it. So basically take it from a truck and put it into a container. And then that container gets taken to the port, whichever port you're looking at. So maybe if it's South Africa, you're going to Houston, say, and then from Houston it'll get on a ship and take anywhere from 25 to 40 days to get to South Africa. Right. And then once it gets there, it has to be picked up by your customer, and they take it to another cold storage after they clear customs. They take it to another facility to unload the container, and then they have to bring it back to the port as well.
Gotcha. In some of our other shows, we've talked about Incoterms, and we've had some guests talk about that. From your experience in that example, selling some proteins to South Africa, what would be the best Incoterm for you to use, right? Like the chain of custody transfers, and you're like, okay, we're out of the mix on this one. What's your expertise on the best Incoterm to use?
The one that gives the producer less risk would be, it's called CIF, so cost and freight basically, and the transfer of title happens as soon as you load it into the container.
Okay.
So as soon as it's in the container, it's really not the producer's problem anymore. It's all liability goes to the buyer. Now obviously there's commercial considerations that you take as a company to kind of help facilitate the transaction, but from a risk standpoint, that's the best.
Right. So that would just, in your example, just get it to Houston.
Yep.
And then from there, it's not your deal.
Yeah. And then obviously on the reverse of that, the most liability for the producer would be delivered, DDP delivered at place.
Mm-hmm.
So we would have responsibility until it got all the way to the point of specified delivery. So like for Korea, sometimes we deliver it all the way to a customer's warehouse. So we're responsible until it actually offloads into the warehouse in Korea, as opposed to at the port in the U.S.
Yeah, I could see how that would be the greatest risk for you, because you don't have as much control with what's happening in another country. So with those extended supply chain timeline, talk a little bit about packaging. Throw it in a box that you buy from Uline or something's probably a little bit different than moving. So what type of packaging is out there that can help you be successful in the cold chain?
So it's really not too different than just kind of throwing it in a box, but obviously on the front end we'll either shrink wrap it or we put it in just some more protective packaging within the box. So when we're shipping, at least internationally, everything is kind of big box items and it gets further processed down. In the U.S., there's, anything from a huge box that you can buy at a wholesaler all the way down to, King Soopers, where they're buying tray pack and bubble trays, and you can go to Costco and buy those big bags, the saddle bags, where it's kind of a U shape and they have a bunch of different. So there's a ton of different packaging options in the U.S. at least, but and those can range in cost from pretty expensive to not very. It just depends on the quality of the products the buyer wants and that sort of thing.
Huh, interesting. So the title of our show is Storytellers, right? And we were talking a little bit before we got on air. There was one story you're kind of really in the thick of right now, and another one that you had mentioned. So tell us a story related to your personal experiences.
So just on the cold storage side, I think the most interesting story I've had is, got a call about 2 a.m. in the winter, maybe January, I think it was, and this guy in Canada called me and said, our freezer's flooded. And, I'm a little out of it, kind of dazed from being woken up. And I said, what are you talking about? And he said, our freezer flooded. And I said, there's water on the floor? He's like, well, it's not really water. It's ice now because, we're running at -10. But
right.
Yeah, there is. There's about 8 inches of ice on the floor. And I said, okay, well, let's find wherever the water is and stop it, obviously. And then we kind of worked back from there. But what had happened was their neighbor was actually foreclosed on, and their pipes burst in the middle of winter. And the water flooded into the freezer from the other location. And it was on the weekend, so they actually hadn't noticed it because they weren't operating on the weekend until they brought a crew in on Sunday to kind of get ahead of the work, and they noticed their whole freezer had 8 inches of ice in it. Now, normally you think just thaw it out and clean up all the water, but we have millions of dollars of product in the freezer, and you can't just thaw it out because we don't want it to go bad.
Right.
So what they had to do was over a couple of weeks take jackhammers and chisel out all the ice until they could get enough of our product moved out of each kind of location, because there's different freezers, they segment them off, until they could get enough of it out so that they could thaw out the room and really clean it up. But it took, a couple months to get this thing really cleaned up.
Wow. The impact that you wouldn't, it's got some water, just thaw it out. What did you do with the product whenever you were moving it out? Right? Did you just try to immediately sell it, or was there another warehouse? So
most of the, like I said, it was about 8 inches. So really only the bottom layers of all the pallets were affected, the product-wise. So all the top, from the bottom layer up, there's probably 6 other layers of product. That was all good, so it was easily sold. Just we had to really ship it out and kind of break down all the pallets. The bottom layers, we had to see if it could be salvaged in any way, sell it to further processors, cookers, or sell it to dog food companies, whatever.
Right.
Or render it, just completely throw it away. So it was just kind of a mix. Yeah,
that's crazy. I would think that your wife would think you're really good at cocktail parties, because you probably have a lot of knowledge, on the supply chain, and you probably have some awesome stories. So we'll have to have you back and tell a few more stories. But your time today is really appreciated. So we want to thank you for joining us on the Connect and Collaborate Network, featuring the supply chain logistics storytellers. Jacob, thanks for being a great storyteller and an educator about the cold chain.
Thank you.
Thank you.